From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And right away, we'll have a visit with K-State's Monte Vandeveer. He'll share his new analysis of the options afforded you corn producers under the crop insurance prevented planting provisions, and with the expected trade aid and higher corn prices tied in. He has projected the economic returns to each of those options, figuring in his projected MFP payments. He'll talk about a new K-State spreadsheet tool that you producers can use to calculate the best option for your situation. Further ahead, this week's K-State horticulture segment, Ward Upham will be with us to talk about side dressing vegetable crops and ornamental flowers with nitrogen here in the early part of summer. All that and more next on Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Well, during our first half hour, we're going to devote considerable time to these still swirling questions that you crop producers are considering as far as your planting delays, particularly in respect to corn, and what your options are as you consider all of the potential support mechanisms out there. Joining us once again is Monte Vandeveer. He's a research and extension agricultural economist for K-State based in southwest Kansas, and he has been grinding away at the information as it comes in seemingly by the minute, Monte, on these decisions on prevented planting, how they dovetail into crop insurance coverage, and the market facilitation program that was announced, all of that going into the pot here. But the options here are multiple. That we can say for sure, right?
Options are multiple, and the things we don't know yet are even bigger list than that. So we're doing our best with what we know at this stage, and we'll try to walk people through that.
All right. Let's start with the crop insurance provisions and the prevented planting deadlines. Well, for corn, the final planting date has passed for the entire state of Kansas.
For the entire state. And then we have another period called the late planting period that extends for another 20 days after that final planting period. And during the late planting period, you can still get your insurance for a crop that gets planted, but the guarantee is going down 1% per day.
And those late planting periods are still intact for corn for most of the state, with one exception, right?
Southeast Kansas has already ended their late planting period. That was June 4th. For central Kansas and northeast Kansas, late planting extends through June 14th. And for the western, roughly third of the state, it extends to June 20th. So those parts of the state still have some time to get in during the late planting period.
So for those still with the late planting period available to them, that adds to their options on how to go from here.
Right. You can still get coverage. As I said, it goes down 1% each day that you're in the late planting period. You can actually plant corn after the late planting period ends, but you only get a 55% production guarantee. So the coverage is almost half of what it originally was at that point.
You can also plant something other than corn, but it depends on whether that's during the late planting period or after, in as far as what you'll get out of that.
Right. That separates two of the options. One of the options is if you decide you want to plant another crop, say soybeans or grain sorghum, you could plant during the late planting period, and the earlier you plant, you presume that you'd hopefully get a little bit better yield. But planting during the LPP means you get no prevent plant payment for corn. On the other hand, if you wait until after the late planting period ends, you can plant that second crop, and you still get 35% of the corn PP payment. But you have to pay 35% of the premium, too.
By the way, all of this is outlined in a presentation that Monte has put together, and you can reference that, which we'll tell you about in a few moments. But those are the straightforward options on prevented planting in the late planting period. Add in some more ingredients here, so to speak, additional factors that have muddied the waters. Let's be honest about it.
Right. Well, we're wondering how much costs and returns might be under each option. We want to make that comparison, of course, but there's still several things we don't know. And the biggest one that came out is this market facilitation program payment. The MFP, that's the trade compensation, for the trade wars, the tariff barriers that have affected exports and prices. It was just announced on May 23rd that there will be another round of payments this year. In fact, the dollar amount, the pool is even bigger than it was last year. But we've got a couple of strings attached there. I think it was confirmed just today that producers will have to plant one of the MFP program crops in 2019 in order to get a payment on that acre.
So that's a very important variable that's going to play into the what-if scenarios, which we'll talk about.
Right. And so if you're looking at not planting anything at all and taking the full corn prevented planting payment, it means you're foregoing that MFP. And we don't know yet how big those payments are going to be, but it's probably going to be at least what we saw last year, maybe more.
Talk about that more in detail in just a second. Another external factor, if you will, with the shorter crop, corn crop, higher prices will ensue in all likelihood. We've seen the rally in the market already, so that has to be figured into what a producer eventually decides.
Right. With the later planting date, we're expecting yields to be lower, but on the other hand, if my yield is down 10%, but prices are up 20%, planting could still make sense. So, and it's going to vary what region you're in and how deep the water is. But if you still have a chance to grow some bushels this year, then that good price makes that option more appealing.
And yet another wrinkle, and that's still being fleshed out and confirmed, but the new disaster relief aid that was approved and signed into law did mention prevented planting payments, some relief along that line.
That's right. That disaster package, that was geared for hurricane relief, and it was a big pot of money, but I think about $3 billion was set aside for agricultural losses, and prevented plantings in 2019 was one of the provisions that's funded. So that has literally just passed in the last day or two, and so we don't know the details yet, how that's going to work.
We'll monitor that and see how that actually lends to the picture here. Back to, though, those market facilitation program payments, how they'll be figured. Nothing is known definitively about that right now. We need to stress that, right, Monte?
That's right. What we do know is that there's going to be one single county payment, a single dollar amount per acre that's going to be paid out regardless of what crop is planted. Now, remember last year it was paid crop by crop. We had $1.65 per bushel for soybeans, just a penny for corn, 14 cents for wheat, and I think 86 cents on grain sorghum. So those payments were made on bushels that were actually produced. Mm-hmm. And, of course, that program was announced after crops were already in the ground. Now, this year, USDA did not want to favor one crop, planting one crop over another, so they said we're going to have this single payment for each county, so we're guessing that it represents a composite of the crop mix in the county. So we'd have to look crop by crop how much each crop might expect for a compensatory payment and what their historic yields have been. But if we got a lot of acres in a crop that gets a small payment, then our county payment overall might not be as big.
Actually, you have taken a stab at this and put a guess on those payments using as the payment rate those commodity by commodity levels that were implemented in 2018. You selected a county in east central Kansas as your example.
Yes, going to be talking about this in Osage County, and so I just took their numbers as an example. I took their 2018 yields. They had a 36 bushel soybean average yield, 66 bushels for corn yield, about 39 for wheat, 70 for grain sorghum. When you multiply that times the 2018 payment rates, then you get roughly a dollar amount for each crop, what you might have expected. So if for example, my soybeans, I had 36 bushels and I got $1.65 MFP payment for it. Well, that's about $59 an acre. Mm-hmm. And then you do the same for the other crops. And but then we have to weight those by the importance of each crop in each county. And
by acres, that is.
Right. And so this particular county happened to be a big soybean county. When you put the weights in for all the crops, I came out with a $38 per acre payment. But 36 of those dollars came from the soybean portion. So, again, that emphasizes counties that have more soybean acres, counties that have better soybean yields, and the same thing with grain sorghum would, other things being equal, probably tend to get a bigger payment under this arrangement.
Of course, all counties will differ in these figures. So that's where we're at right now.
That's we're stretching to even say this much.
Right. Monte, stand by if you would. There are more elements to this that we want to get into. Monte Vandeveer is our guest, agricultural economist with K-State Research and Extension, as we're considering the prevented planting payments and other returns to prevented planting decisions that corn producers in specific are going to be contending with here, and some of the possibilities regarding all of that. He has put together information on this, which we're referencing today. We'll be back shortly with more on this on Agriculture Today.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Continuing on now on Agriculture Today, our conversation with agricultural economist Monte Vandeveer of K-State Research and Extension. Again, Monte has put together some extensive information on these questions concerning prevented planting of corn and what potential options would be the best for producers. And this is something that each individual producer will have to walk through on their own. And there are tools to do that, which we'll share in just a moment. One of those things that's playing into this, obviously, Monte, as we look forward and as producers contemplate their alternatives here, what will the corn market do? And as mentioned earlier, with a shorter crop, prices are likely to rally, and they have already on the pretense of a short crop. So any insight on that particular variable?
Well, we've already seen the market react, as you said, and we know there's going to be fewer acres planted. Pretty good bet that the aggregate yield numbers are going to be down. So everyone's convinced there'll be less corn produced this year. So we're still figuring out how big those numbers are going to be. But if you are looking at one of these options where you go ahead and plant, say, your corn a little bit late, or even plant one of the other crops, this higher tide of market prices gives a little bit bigger advantage to planting something if you think you can still get a decent yield.
You've been collaborating with your fellow agricultural economist, Dan O'Brien, on some planting and yield scenarios that can lend to this. This can get very deeply into the weeds here, but what in general have you come up with?
Well, Dan, we've got this article posted on agmanager.info. Dan looked at 4 different scenarios. Suppose corn acres are down 10 million acres. Suppose they're down 15 million acres. And then 2 yield scenarios, too. Suppose aggregate national yield is 172 per acre. Or, worst case, suppose it's down to 167 bushels per acre. So he tried to map out what production would be and then how prices would respond in each of those situations.
And what was the conclusion there as far as price response?
Well, for the cases when acres are down 10 million, we end up with total crop on the order of 12 to 12.5 billion bushels. The price in that scenario would be about $4.35 a bushel. Could be $1 higher if we see yields even worse. If you look at the lower planted acre scenario, suppose planted acres are down 15 million, we've got a price in the high 5s to low 6s, depending on which yield outcome we get.
So once more, that's all unknown, but it's a good baseline for thinking about what might be ahead and making one's decisions. And then you pull all of this back to those options that we talked about earlier that are availed to producers who didn't get their corn in on time or won't be able to get it planted whatsoever. The first option, not planting corn, collecting a full prevented planting payment. Mm-hmm. How does that shake out in costs and returns when you look at all this?
Well, you get the full prevented planting payment on that. That's 55% of your revenue guarantee. You're going to save your corn production costs. You might still have some weed control or you're allowed to plant a cover crop. You would not be eligible for the MFP payment. So you're getting that full prevented planting payment and saving production costs, but no other income there.
Mm-hmm. So for this first option, Monte, you've again put numbers to this and come up with a potential net return to that alternative.
Right. We were looking just to put some dollars and cents and try to compare these. Came up with an example farm. I'm assuming 120 bushel per acre corn APH yield, and I took 75% coverage. So my production guarantee is 90 bushels per acre, and multiply that times the $4 projected price. I've got a revenue guarantee of $360 per acre. Now, if I do option 1, I take the full prevented planting payment, I get 55% of that $360 guarantee. So that's about $198 per acre. And say I have some weed control costs, I still pay my crop insurance premium out of that. In this example farm, we're still looking at a net of about $150 per acre.
Again, that's collecting the full prevented planting payment, not planting corn. The second option is planting corn late, and no prevented planting payment is going to be available there.
Right. Suppose you go ahead and plant your corn, then probably going to see a little bit lower yield, but hopefully prices will rally and offset that. You give up the prevented planting payment, still have your production costs, and you should be eligible still for that MFP payment.
So for this second option, one chooses again to plant corn late but not earn that prevented planting payment. How does that work out in the numbers?
Well, I assumed 20% yield reduction, so my actual corn yield is down to 96 bushels per acre, but I'm assuming I'm getting that $4.35 cash price on it. So revenue comes in about $418 per acre. I've got about $244 an acre on expenses. Now, that uses the K-State farm management budgets. Expenses that are still have to be paid, so you net that out, I'm at about $174 per acre. So that's before we consider the MFP. Mm-hmm. So that case shows actually a slight advantage to taking the full prevented planting option.
For the third option, one doesn't plant corn, chooses to plant a second crop, substitute crop, if you will. in that window of late prevented planting for corn these next couple of weeks then. How would that pan out economically?
Well, for my eastern Kansas example, I assumed we planted soybeans, got 42 bushel yield on that. Soon prices have gone up to about $9 a bushel, and so that gives me total revenue of about $378. Mm-hmm. My budgets say the expenses will run about $219, so I'm netting about $159 per acre. So you see, we're coming in very close to what that full corn prevented planting payment was. If you add the MFP payment on top of that, then there'd even be an advantage going that direction.
And to round this out, the fourth option that you cited, once more you plant that second crop, but after the late prevented planting period for corn, and you would earn a 35% prevented planting payment for corn. The numbers say what there?
Well, if I wait a little bit longer to plant that second crop, again, I'm looking at soybeans, I'm assuming a little bit of a yield deduction on that. So I figured, for an example, just going down to 30 bushel yield, same $9 price, but I'm going to get $69 an acre on my corn prevented planting. That's 35% of what I would have gotten otherwise. Mm-hmm. So revenue's about $339. Input costs, including the corn insurance premium, the share I still have to pay. Right. Expenses about $220. So netting about $118 per acre. So that's the lowest return. We'd probably have to see some MFP payment on that to make it look a little bit more appealing. Now,
that's a slew of numbers, and these are examples. Clearly, an individual producer has to plug in their own figures, walk through the scenarios, and try to come up with the most learned decision they possibly can. There are tools out there to assist them in just that, right? Right. In fact, the assumptions we make on prices and yields can really push the results around. And we also know everybody's situation is going to be a little bit different. And so we've posted this Excel spreadsheet online. It's on agmanager.info. Just came out this week. And that lets users plug in their own prices and yields, even plug in their own MFP value. And they'll find how sensitive the results are to these assumptions. If we look at a lower yield, but prices really don't go up that much, then that prevented planting payment starts to look more attractive. So really encourage producers to make their own best judgments on what the numbers are. We've got that tool they can use. Should mention the spreadsheet. It lists soybeans as a second crop, but I think you can swap out something like grain sorghum. Just plug in the different costs, yields, and prices, and the formulas all work the same. That's an invaluable tool given all of the factors in the mix here. And again, it is found at agmanager.info. KSU prevented planting for corn. And you can put your numbers in, come up with scenarios that will hopefully lend clarity to your decision on what you'll do about prevented planting and the potential returns in all these possibilities. Monte, yeoman work here. And thank you for coming over, sharing a good bit of it with us today, and looking forward to more information on the MFP payments and so forth to add to the story. Thank you, Eric. Appreciate your time. Along with us, Monte Vandeveer. He is an agricultural economist for K-State Research and Extension based in southwest Kansas. Take full advantage of all of the work that Monte and his colleagues have done in putting together that tool for calculating all of this at agmanager.info. We'll be back with more on this Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
You're tuned to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And next up for you, today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, officials from Mexico arrived at the White House yesterday for a high-level face-to-face meeting, hoping for a deal to stave off President Trump's threatened tariffs on Mexican goods imported into the United States. The first tariffs, 5% on imports from Mexico, are to go into effect next Monday, barring an agreement. The U.S. delegation to yesterday's talks was led by Vice President Mike Pence. They said they were ready to listen to Mexico's ideas for meeting the demands that country step up its efforts to halt Central American migrants from making their way to the U.S. border. That's according to two officials who spoke only on the condition of anonymity. White House Trade Advisor Peter Navarro said that if there were commitments from Mexico, they could avoid the tariffs. And Republican Chuck Grassley of Iowa, the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, told reporters that Mexico was putting proposals on the table that he expected would resolve the standoff. Now, administration officials have said Mexico could prevent the tariffs by securing its southern border with Guatemala, cracking down on criminal smuggling organizations, and entering into a safe third country agreement that would make it difficult for those who enter Mexico from other countries to claim asylum in the U.S. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, Republicans in Congress have been threatening a rare confrontation with the president, warning that the White House should be ready to have them stand up to the president to try to block his tariffs, which they worry would imperil a major pending U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade deal. Now, a leading USDA trade official weighed in on the possible tariffs against Mexico in comments, as we hear in this report from the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
Speaking by phone from an agricultural trade mission in Colombia, USDA Undersecretary Ted McKinney was asked about the threat of possible tariffs against Mexico.
Well, I'd have to say that overall agriculture has been disappointed in that. Clearly, only a week or two prior, the steel and aluminum tariffs had been lifted. So just speaking honestly with what we're hearing, there has been disappointment.
The U.S. and Mexican ag secretaries met earlier this week.
And all we could do is encourage them that if there are things that they can do to help address their issues at the border, and if those things are ones that we can help with in some way, we want to be the consummate friends that we are and try to get trade back normal.
At the same time, he says the issue is still in flux.
I'm hoping that we might get some new information when the president returns from the very momentous D-Day commemoration, and we'll see where it goes.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
The House Appropriations Committee has approved their version of the fiscal year 2020 appropriations package for the USDA and the Food and Drug Administration, sending it forward on a 29-21 vote. That plan includes provisions to prevent the USDA from spending funds to move the Economic Research Service and the National Institute for Food and Agriculture out of the Washington, D.C. metro area. The panel also approved amendments to freeze funding for USDA relative to finalizing its swine slaughter inspection rule. The package would provide $24 billion in discretionary spending for the USDA, the FDA, and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, $1 billion more than the fiscal 19 enacted mark. And the USDA should make sure that it applies a strict requirement relative to what's considered actively engaged in farming as it implements the 2018 Farm Bill provisions that added first cousins, nieces, and nephews to the definition of family members. That, according to Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa and Representative Jeff Fortenberry of Nebraska in a letter to USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue. The two lawmakers labeled the expanded family definition in the Farm Bill as, in their words, highly controversial, even as the bill won approval by a wide margin. They called on the USDA to make sure that expanding the definition of family members does not turn into an even larger loophole that increases payments to passive investors and mega farms, in their words. Now, the rule adopted in 2015 on actively engaged was applied to a very small percentage of farming operations, the two said. They added that the USDA needs to effectively administer the law. This is Agriculture Today, and now on to this week's Kansas soybean update with Greg Akagi. Greg?
Joe Reichert, who is a farmer from Paola, is joining us. And Joe, you were the winner of the State Proficiency Award from FFA, and the award was specifically for oil crop production, and the Kansas Soybean Commission is proud to sponsor that particular award. Congratulations, first off, but talk about your application and some of the things you guys do on your family farm.
Most off, we plant mainly soybean, and we'll rotate it with corn, but we plant roughly around 3,000 acres of soybeans, and that's mainly our main crop. With usually on our better dirt, we rotate it in with the corn, and then most of the production we do on our farm.
So what were some of your responsibilities and even management decisions related to the SAE award?
Usually I run the planter, and I run the sprayer in the spring, and in the summer I'll run the sprayer for post, and then in the fall, I usually run the combine to harvest all our beans and corn.
When doing this, did you have any challenges that you faced in the award area? And if you did, how'd you overcome those challenges?
Probably the main challenge was we run a lot of modern technology on our farm, like GPS and everything. And that was a pretty good challenge trying to figure out how to run all that. So I just kind of sat back and did some research and figured out how to run everything, and kind of helped me along the way. I used a lot of the internet to figure out things and called a lot of friends to help me out, and that was probably my biggest challenge.
So what were some of the things when you were working through this in the award area itself, maybe accomplishments or findings that you found during that time frame?
Probably the biggest accomplishment that I've ever had was probably learning how to run the sprayer, and probably trying to figure out, the numbers you got to do in to mix the chemicals, and, because you don't want to put too much and kill your crop, because then you won't have a crop there.
And if you think back, what were some of the experiences or opportunities that you take away from doing the SAE?
Well, probably the best opportunity I had was that my dad and my grandpa started this farm, and I could fall into this farm instead of trying to do it all on my own. I had someone there more to guide me on how to do everything.
That is Joe Reichert, a farmer from Paola. He was also the SAE Proficiency Award winner for the FFA in oil crop production. The Kansas Soybean Commission is proud to sponsor that particular award. This has been the latest edition of the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Thanks, Greg, and you're listening to Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
We're back now on this Agriculture Today, and up next for you this week's K-State Horticulture segment. This is into nutrient management for those vegetable gardens and those flower beds and borders. It's time that you might consider a booster shot, if you will, of nitrogen for those plants. We're talking once again with K-State horticulturist Ward Upham on side dressing those vegetables and ornamental flowers. When we use this term side dressing, just to be specific, Ward, what exactly does that mean?
So that means you're actually fertilizing those plants not just at planting, but also during the growth phase. And so you're coming alongside those plants and giving a little bit of nitrogen fertilizer so that they'll continue to do well. Now, if you're using organic fertilizers, such as something that has a lot of manure compost or something like that, most of this won't be necessary. You just watch the plants. If they start to get a little yellow, then you may have to side dress them as well. But if you're using chemical fertilizers like most people use, often side dressing can make a real big difference in how they do.
Let's get more into that, why one would need to side dress that crop or that flower.
And the reason for that is that we have 3 nutrients that are called macronutrients. There's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Well, phosphorus and potassium stick to the soil. Nitrogen doesn't. and it's used in large quantities, and so it usually doesn't last very long in the soil. Now, if it's an organic source, that is released over a longer period of time as the organic material breaks down. But with other fertilizers, it's released fairly quickly, and therefore you can run out of it, especially this year. We've had so much rain this year that most of that nitrogen is gone, and it'd be a really good idea to side dress some of our vegetable and annual flower crops.
Well, let's break this into two parts along those very lines, if we might. Your vegetable garden, there's a handy reference that folks can use, right?
That's right, and it lists all the different vegetable crops. It also lists annual flowers as well as a group. And it tells you not only the crop, but how much to add, when to add it, how many times to add it, all that type of thing. The easiest way to find this is actually do a search. And you want to do a search on side dressing. So that's side and dressing, but as one word. And then the person that wrote it was Greg Eyestone. And so also add the word Eyestone. And so it's eye and stone, again, is one word. So it'll be side dressing, eye stone. When you do a search on that, that first link should come up to be what you need.
And what they'll see is a list of criteria for side dressing, timeline, the rates of application, so forth?
All of that type of stuff. So a lot of our crops, vegetable crops, they may only need to be fertilized once. Some you don't actually side dress at all. But there are others, such as tomatoes, that are actually fertilized several times. Usually with tomatoes, you fertilize at planting. And then again when that green fruit reaches full size before it changes color. And then third time after you pick the first fruit, and then again 1 month later. And so you actually end up fertilizing those 4 times if you count the one where you fertilize at planting. However, it's easy to overdo this stuff. And so you don't want to fertilize like every week. Sometimes you have people that fertilize tomatoes every week. What you end up in that case is you're going to end up with a very large, very nice plant and no fruit.
You're stimulating plant growth, but not reproductive
That's right.
processes.
Yeah, we call that vegetative growth. You're stimulating that vegetative growth, but not fruit production. So don't overdo it. Just put on what is recommended, and that will keep those plants going and keep them producing.
What about the product selection, though, Ward? One needs to be somewhat particular here, don't they?
You do. What you're after is a nitrogen fertilizer. Now, when you first put down the fertilizer before planting, that may have some phosphorus and potassium in it. Hopefully, you've done a soil test and added what they recommended. But once you're into side dressing, normally what we want is primarily nitrogen. Now, if you look at a fertilizer bag, they're always going to have 3 numbers on it. And that first number is always percent nitrogen, second, always percent phosphorus, third, always percent potassium. And what you're after is that nitrogen, that first number. So what you want is a fertilizer where that first number is larger than the other 2. And as far as how much to add, just read the bag and put on what they recommend. Now, if you have a hard time finding a fertilizer that's high in nitrogen, you can use a lawn fertilizer. They are often very high in nitrogen without much of the other nutrients, and that'll work just fine. Just makes absolutely sure it doesn't have any weed preventer or weed killer in it. But it'll work fine if it doesn't have those 2 products.
And we're talking about water-soluble products in almost all circumstances, aren't we?
That's right. So what you're after is something that is going to dissolve. It may be applied dry, or in some cases you can mix it with water and apply it that way as well. But once it comes in contact with water, it's going to dissolve and then go into the soil. So if you do apply a dry fertilizer, you're going to have to water it in, maybe 1/4 to 1/2 inch of water, and that'll be plenty to get it down into that root zone where the plant can take it up.
And once more, your application intervals will vary with the vegetable crop in question.
That's right. It all depends on what crop you're talking about. Now, annual flowers are a little bit different deal. As we said before with tomatoes, you fertilize them too much, and you're going to throw them off bearing. Annual flowers have been bred so that they will react to high levels of fertilizer. So they'll produce a lot of flowers even if they're given a lot of fertilization. So like all other crops, you're going to fertilize at planting. Then wait 4 to 6 weeks and side dress. And then side dress again every month thereafter. And so you're just hitting them once a month once you get past that first month. And that'll keep them going. That'll keep them growing well. Just make sure that you're watering them as well. If you don't water them, they're not using that fertilizer. And that can build up and cause some damage if you fertilize without having them growing.
But that's a pretty simple routine for your ornamental flowers.
It is. Just remember once a month and you'll be fine.
But the main thing here is to distinguish between your crops as to what they need and how often, in particular with the vegetables, that they need to be tended to. And don't overdo it because it can cause issues with tomatoes and other plants. And please check out this fact sheet that K-State Research and Extension has put together. It'll give you all you need to know about side dressing those vegetables or those ornamental flowers. Search for side dressing and eye stone as your keywords there, and that'll take you right to it. Print a copy off and put it to good use as you maintain those gardens, be they flower or vegetable gardens, throughout the remainder of this growing season. Ward, thanks for the tips right here.
You bet.
Ward Upham with us, horticulturist with K-State Research and Extension on this week's Horticulture segment. Thanks once more for being along with us. We'll return right here tomorrow, this same time, and hope you'll do the same. Eric Atkinson here, bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.